Trump just ordered the most aggressive naval blockade of a major energy choke point since World War II. Oil jumped 8% on the announcement, and then something happened that was not supposed to happen. Within hours of a Chinese defense official saying 4 words, the oil price started falling back. Those 4 words were, "It is open for us." That is China's defense minister confirming, publicly and on the record, that Chinese vessels will keep transiting the Strait of Hormuz regardless of what the U.S. Navy says. And the market believed him. The price drop is the signal. When oil falls after a blockade announcement, it is not because traders think the situation got better, it is because they are pricing in one specific outcome: the blockade does not hold. Let me show you what the data is actually telling us here. Because when you line up what China already has pre-positioned, what Saudi Arabia is now threatening, and what the oil market is pricing in simultaneously, the picture that emerges is not a U.S. strategy under pressure. It is a U.S. strategy collapsing from 3 directions at once. I'm Mike. I track patterns in geopolitics and economics, and this story registers immediately as significant, not because of the headline, but because of the mechanism underneath it. Before the war, the Strait of Hormuz was moving roughly 20% of the world's oil and natural gas every single day, 13 million barrels per day in crude alone. When U.S. strikes on Iran began on February 28th, Iran shut that waterway down, cutting traffic to a trickle and sending oil to $119 a barrel at its peak. Then came a 2-week ceasefire on April 7th. Talks began in Islamabad. Those talks collapsed on April 12th, and Trump's response was a naval blockade targeting all vessels entering or departing Iranian ports. Iran earns approximately $45 billion per year from oil exports, roughly 13% of its entire GDP. Cut that off, and the logic goes, the economic pressure forces Tehran back to the table. That is the mechanism. It seems clean. It seems surgical. It has one problem, and that problem has a name. The name of the problem is China, and here is what most analysis of this blockade skips entirely. China did not wait for the blockade to be announced before preparing for it. According to data compiled by Koppler, there are approximately 38 million barrels of Iranian oil sitting on tankers in Asian waters right now, with more than a third of those ships anchored in the Yellow Sea directly off the Chinese coast. On top of that, crude inventories in Shandong province, home to most of China's independent refiners known as teapots, are near their highest levels this year. Think about what that means operationally. Before Trump announced a single restriction, China had already pre-positioned roughly a month's worth of Iranian supply buffer. The blockade is supposed to cut Iran's oil revenue by blocking its largest buyer, but China's refineries can run for weeks without needing a single additional barrel from Iran. The financial pressure mechanism has a 30 to 40-day lag built right into it at minimum. You could call this a coincidence of timing. You could call it strategic preparation. Both would be accurate, but one of them is considerably more likely given that China gets approximately 1/3 of its entire national oil supply through the Strait of Hormuz. And here is the critical detail that makes this more than just a storage story. China's defense minister Admiral Dong Jun did not stay quiet about any of this. He confirmed publicly that Chinese vessels are actively moving through the strait and that Beijing will honor its trade and energy agreements with Tehran. His exact words, "Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz and it is open for us." That is not a diplomatic statement. That is a direct challenge to U.S. naval authority in international waters, and the oil market heard it and repriced immediately. Brent, which had spiked to $103 on the blockade announcement, pulled back below 100 as traders reassessed whether enforcement would hold. Here is what the market data actually shows when you look at the full picture, not just the futures headline. The Brent crude futures price, the number that shows up in every news search, settled near $99 Monday. That is the paper price. The physical market, what refiners actually pay for oil delivered to their facility right now, has been trading at $132, with a peak near $148. That gap of more than $30 between the paper futures number and the real-world delivery price exists because financial mechanisms including strategic petroleum reserve releases are suppressing the headline number. What you pay at the pump tracks the physical market, not the paper market. The U.S. national average for unleaded gasoline hit $4.12 on Monday, up more than $1.20 since the war began. Iran's parliamentary speaker said publicly that the blockade would make Americans nostalgic for $4 to $5 gas. That statement deserves to be taken literally, not dismissed as rhetoric. JP Morgan analysts wrote that reopening the strait has become the market's most time-sensitive priority. Capital Economics chief economist Neil Shearing asked the exact right question in a research note. Would the U.S. Navy seize Allied ships that paid tolls to Tehran? Would it target Chinese vessels in the strait? He added, either outcome would represent a significant escalation, and this is the structural trap. The blockade works only if it is enforced. Enforcement against Chinese-linked vessels is a categorical escalation the administration has not publicly committed to. An enforcement that stops short of Chinese vessels is a blockade with a 95% hole in it, because before the war, China was buying 95% of all the crude Iran exported. Watch what happens when you line those numbers up. Iran's oil export revenue is $45 billion per year. China's share of that revenue stream is effectively all of it. The blockade's pressure mechanism is dependent on China stopping purchases. China's response is 38 million barrels pre-positioned, its defense minister confirming ongoing transit, and ships already sailing through. Here is where the second front opens, and this one hits the United States from inside its own alliance. Saudi Arabia is pressing the U.S. to drop the blockade, not politely raising concerns, pressing. Arab officials confirmed to the Wall Street Journal that Riyadh has warned Washington directly the blockade could push Iran to escalate in a way that destroys Saudi Arabia's own remaining export capacity. Here is the geography that makes this threat real. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz at the start of the war, Saudi Arabia rerouted its crude exports through the East-West pipeline, pumping oil across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Saudi Arabia managed to restore exports to roughly 7 million barrels per day using that route, essentially returning to pre-war levels despite the strait being shut. But the Red Sea route has one exit point, the Bab al-Mandeb, and Saudi Arabia is warning Washington that Iran is now actively pressuring the Houthis in Yemen to close it. The Houthis control a long stretch of Yemen's coastline directly adjacent to the Bab al-Mandeb, and they demonstrated during the Gaza conflict exactly how effectively they can disrupt Red Sea shipping when they choose to. Adam Barron, a Yemen specialist at the Policy Institute New America, stated it plainly. If Iran wants to shut down the Bab al-Mandeb, the Houthis are the obvious partner, and their response to Gaza demonstrates they have the capacity. Saudi Arabia's calculation here is not abstract. Consultancy Vortexa estimated that in wartime conditions, the Yanbu port terminal's actual throughput capacity is around 3 million barrels per day, well below its nominal maximum. If the Bab al-Mandeb closes, Saudi Arabia's export workaround collapses with it. There is no third route. This is why Saudi Arabia is not just expressing concern. It is telling its primary security guarantor, your blockade threatens to set off a chain reaction that destroys our economy. Here is what most analysis of this confrontation misses entirely when it focuses on the oil price. The blockade was never only about Iran. Bloomberg made this point directly in a piece published today. The blockade is as much about China as it is about Tehran. The pressure chain the U.S. is trying to activate runs. Blockade cuts Iran's oil exports. China loses its supply. China pressures Iran to negotiate. Iran reopens the strait. Trump said publicly that Xi Jinping would like to see the war end, signaling the administration believes that leverage over Beijing exists. But the pressure chain requires China to comply at step 2, and China is not complying at step 2. The Trump administration separately threatened China with an additional 50% tariff if Beijing supplies advanced defense equipment to Iran. China denied it, and Trump is simultaneously planning a state visit to Beijing next month. These three positions cannot all be maintained at the same time without one of them breaking. The market is watching which one breaks first, and consider the knock-on effects beyond oil. In 2024, 84% of crude and condensate shipped through the strait was destined for Asian markets. Europe receives 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar through that same waterway. The Persian Gulf region accounts for 30 to 35% of global urea exports and 20 to 30% of global ammonia exports. When that waterway stays disrupted, the secondary wave hits fertilizer supply chains, European energy markets, and food production costs across Asia simultaneously. JP Morgan is not wrong that reopening the strait is the market's most time-sensitive priority. It is also the world's most time-sensitive logistics priority, and the blockade is making reopening harder, not easier, by antagonizing the one country that has the most actual leverage over Tehran. Here's my read on where the data points over the next 2 to 4 weeks. The blockade is either going to become porous or it is going to escalate. Those are the only two outcomes available to it. A porous blockade, where Chinese-linked and Iran-adjacent vessels continue transiting without being physically stopped, becomes symbolic. Iran continues exporting at reduced but non-zero levels. The financial pressure on Tehran accumulates slowly enough that it does not force a settlement before the ceasefire expires on April 22nd, and every government watching this conflict draws the lesson that U.S. naval blockades have a ceiling defined by Chinese commercial interests. An escalated blockade, where the U.S. physically stops or boards a Chinese-linked vessel, triggers the confrontation that China's pre-positioning and its defense minister's statement were explicitly designed to prevent. Watch 3 specific indicators. First, how many more sanctioned vessels transit the strait and whether any are physically interdicted. The moment one gets stopped, this becomes a U.S.-China confrontation, not a U.S.-Iran one. Second, whether Saudi Arabia takes its opposition public rather than keeping it in diplomatic channels. If Riyadh goes on record publicly, the Gulf alliance fractures visibly. Third, Houthi positioning near the Bab al-Mandeb. Any preparation near that choke point is the warning signal for a second supply shock layered on top of the first. The ceasefire expires April 22nd. That is the hard deadline. The blockade was built on 3 assumptions. Allies would follow, trading partners would comply, and financial pressure would force Iran's hand. Saudi Arabia is not following. China is not complying. And the 38 million barrel buffer means the financial pressure on Tehran takes weeks to materialize, even if enforcement tightens overnight. When the 3 core assumptions of a strategy all fail simultaneously, you are not watching a policy setback. You are watching a policy that has already failed and has not been told so yet. Because when your naval blockade gets ignored by the world's second largest economy before the first week is out, desperation becomes visible. And visible desperation is the last thing a financial system built on confidence can afford. Thank you all for watching, subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.